Since its existence, the train has been an ideal propaganda tool. On all continents, monarchs, presidents, and dictators have all wanted their own train to crisscross countries, promote their policies, and meet the people. In the 1930s, in Germany, as Chancellor, Hitler decided that he too needed an exceptional train to match his power. It would be a Titan pulled by 2 locomotives, protected by anti-aircraft batteries. On board, men mobilized for war, private bodyguards, railway police, and officers of the German army. Its name, somewhat ironically, Führersonderzug Amerika, the Führer's special train, America. A steel beast of 1,200 tons, 430 meters long, with state-of-the-art cars equipped with the highest technology of the day. It was an Air Force One before its time, a veritable Nazi fortress on rail.
The 20mm guns had an upwards ground range of up to 4.7 kilometers.
Führersonderzug is the best equipped mobile headquarters in the world at that time, the very best.
For each of its journeys, hundreds of men were called into action, manning tracks, bridges, tunnels, and stations. Their mission, to protect America from Hitler's enemies. Hitler's private train was more than a means of transport. It was a genuine bunker, a headquarters, and a refuge. Whole pages of the history of World War II were written on board, tragic decisions taken, decisive meetings held. Pétain, Mussolini, and Franco all climbed aboard to visit the Nazi dictator. The strategic train was even the target of plots against the Führer. But America was an impregnable beast of steel. 70 years on, and little is really known about Hitler's train. Very few people have studied it, and yet it shows us another side to the German dictator, that of a paranoid man with a severe case of megalomania. We went back in time to learn more. How was this steel beast designed? What railway megastructures were built to ensure its security?
So these are absolutely enormous, 480-meter-long tunnels, 20 meters high.
How is life organized on board? Why was nothing or nobody able to attack America? And what does the train teach us about Hitler? We went to Germany to film what remains of other Nazi special trains with their luxury cars. We found the last surviving archives. We retraced the routes the Führer traveled as we tried to uncover the secrets of the steel beast. Now join us on board America, Hitler's private train. Back to the early 1930s. Hitler was head of a political party, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, which was on the rise. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany, and he took the reins of power. He was a modern politician who won over large crowds. He knew how to reach out to people, with his appearance and his speeches, which he belted out with fury, possessed with his own ideas. But he had another asset. He understood that to reach the people, he had to go out to meet them. So in the early 1930s, before any other politicians of the day, Hitler became aware of the importance of travel, and he crisscrossed all Germany during his political campaigns.
Hitler likes to be seen at this time. He feels history is behind him, the German people are largely behind him, so he is happy to show himself quite often.
As a fan of modernity, technology, and power, Hitler wanted to be able to move fast all the time. At the time, another European dictator had his own private train, Benito Mussolini. In 1937, Hitler commissioned the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German railroad company, to conduct a special train for him. After 2 years of design and manufacture, it left the factory in August 1939. It was named America. To Hitler, America represented the annihilation of the Indians. He was fascinated by this land of conquest. Hitler planned to conquer all Europe and annihilate all those who weren't Aryans. And his train matched his ambitions, almighty. It traveled at speeds up to 120 kilometers per hour. Each car weighed at least 60 tons. This steel beast was a very high-performance tool. Like in a fixed headquarters, a bunker, America ensured Hitler's security, allowed him to be surrounded by his teams on journeys, to be mobile on all fronts, and to remain reachable at all times, something which cars and planes were unable to provide. It was a kind of Air Force One before its time, crammed with high technology.
A very impressive train to look at. I wouldn't call it scary, I would call it impressive, with its austerity and its total lack of fancy trimmings.
Hitler used his train to show he was close to the people. He was greeted by crowds, but each outing was strictly organized and highly securitized.
But one of the things the bodyguards become very concerned about, particularly with the train, is when the train pulls in at stations, often mobs of people will stampede to the train, like it's a rock star arriving, trying to touch Hitler, to shake his hand, and somebody could have thrown a hand grenade into the train or even pulled him physically out of a window. Anything could have happened. So it becomes increasingly obvious that Hitler does require some kind of special train which will be cut off from the public and indeed from the military as well.
Very soon, all Nazi dignitaries were having their own private trains built. Hitler had launched an out-and-out fashion.
Dieser Hitlerzug hat bewirkt,
Hitler's train made all the other bigwigs of the Third Reich, men like Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, Himmler, the head of the SS, want their own private train to take them all over the country. At the outbreak of war, there were 25 special trains.
300 cars for the 25 trains with poignant names inspired by America. Asian, Africa, Atlas, Atlantic, Prussia. As if the Third Reich had already conquered the entire world. They were all based on the model, with cars built by German manufacturers, and all looked alike, both inside and out. To such an extent that they were often confused, especially the trains of Hitler and Goering. America would cover thousands and thousands of kilometers of rail track during the war years, a steel beast which shunted everything out of its way, similar to Hitler's conquests. Depending on war requirements and the number of people on board, the makeup of the train varied between 10 to 16 cars, a length of 300 to 430 meters, the equivalent of 2 French high-speed TGV trains. America was a convoy of 1,200 tons, a town on the tracks, with sometimes over 200 people on board. The cars in the middle of the train were always placed in the same way to keep circulation between the communication cars and the HQ cars consistent. These were regular steel Deutsche Reichsbahn passenger cars, the height of modernity, adapted for the Führer's needs.
Die Waggons selber waren nicht gepanzert.
The cars themselves weren't armored. They were built in the 1930s in 3 renowned German factories: Henschel, Wegmann, and Crede. The inside was furbished by a well-known interior design company, Associated Workshops, which was based in Munich. These workshops were well known because they introduced Art Nouveau into Germany in the early 20th century.
And here's Hitler's private car, weighing in at a colossal 63 tons, something that gave rise to the rumor that it was heavily armored. But the truth is even more surprising. Hitler had a 100% marble bathroom installed, with a reinforced concrete subfloor to support the considerable extra weight. What's more, like in all the cars, there was a heating and air conditioning system, very rare for the time, which allowed the Führer to regulate the ambient temperature. The highest technology even for daily life. This car was the third from the front, just after the first baggage car. You entered via an antechamber, permanently guarded by 2 soldiers. The fairly simple living area, with its large table and comfortable armchairs in the middle, had veined mahogany walls. Hitler's apartment consisted of a bedroom with a single bed. His famous bathroom had a bathtub and gold-plated faucets. Next came 3 guest rooms and a washroom. 2 soldiers also kept permanent guard at the rear end of the car.
Letztlich war dieser Stil, der hier in diesen
Basically, the style we see here in the lounge car was fairly middle class, old-fashioned middle class. Most of the features have a relatively functional design. There's very little decoration or ornamentation.
Dekor und wenig Ornamentik.
He believed luxury belonged to the state. As a man, he liked sobriety, a degree of austerity even.
September 3rd, 1939. A big day for America. The train would make its first military journey from Berlin to Bad Polsen, a small town in northwest Poland. Hitler had just started World War II by invading Poland. The world entered into armed conflict, the biggest mankind had ever known, one of the darkest pages in our history. 62 million men, women, and children would lose their lives. And it was on board this train that the fate of Poland and the rest of the world would be decided. Hitler had made it his new military headquarters. Mobile and impressive, it would now escort the Führer to all fronts. As war raged in Poland for several long days, America, like its owner, gave off an air of invincibility. From the train, Hitler dictated his military strategy. Over the coming days, it will become a kind of second home, shared by high-ranking Nazi dignitaries, but also by secretaries, cooks, Hitler's private bodyguards, his doctor, train drivers and engineers, and of course, the soldiers who manned the anti-aircraft batteries. A whole Nazi ant nest came to life.
So Hitler has a very large staff of adjutants. He has valets looking after his every need, dressing him, providing clean clothes. There are chambermaids on board to make the beds. Very carefully vetted staff who act as waiters and maitre d's and all of this in the dining carriages. So these are some of the best waiters they can find in Germany to do this.
The train offered unexpected commodities, a touch of luxury at the height of war, like the car entirely dedicated to bathing with its hairdresser, a refined area enjoyed by Hitler and his prestigious guests. It was presented to the Führer by the Reichsbahn for his 50th birthday on April 20th, 1939. The marble and the 11,200-liter water tank made the car extremely heavy at 78 tons. It was the 9th car from the front, just after the guest sleeper car. The first room, isolated from the asbestos, was fitted with 2 2,000-liter water tanks. Then a small dressing room, followed by 5 bathrooms, 2 of which had bathtubs in marble and enameled steel. Hitler shaved himself, but his private barber cut his hair every 2 weeks in the hairdressing suite. Finally, 3 shower cabins in marble and a washroom.
The bathroom facilities were, of course, state-of-the-art, the very best shower baths. Hitler was somebody who enjoyed those aspects of his life, very much so.
Hitler's days started fairly late, around 10 o'clock, when he would go to the command post for discussions with the head of strategic operations. He would be updated on the morning's progress. He gave few orders. He mostly observed and let the teams get on with their work. The only demand he made was no smoking.
You have to imagine life on board as something that reflected the train's master, extremely austere and essentially dedicated to work. He was a man who was always in his dynamic of power.
America was a genuine haven of peace as it weaved its way across northern Poland in September 1939, taking Hitler to support his army as it advanced in the noise and fury of the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War.
Poland was attacked from every possible side, and it shared many of its borders with Germany. The German army managed to cross all of these borders. Hitler would immediately organize the occupation of Poland in an extremely cruel way for the Polish people. He wanted to show them that their homeland would be Germanized and become part of the Reich.
The Soviet Union, with which the Germans had signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939, invaded the western part of Poland on September 17th. The country was on its knees and surrendered on October 6th, 5 weeks after the outbreak of war. Hitler's dream was coming true before his very eyes, the creation of a great German empire. With the conquest of Poland achieved, Hitler returned to the Chancellery in Berlin, while America, as always, was parked up in a highly guarded zone at Tempelhof Airport, just outside the capital. The Nazis were obsessive about security. To ensure it, a meticulous system of logistics was put in place.
There are entire regiments of SS and Wehrmacht troops whose only job is to protect Hitler, to protect the train, to protect his cars, his planes, and to protect the transport routes to and from his military headquarters. The train itself has to undergo a very thorough security check, including with sniffer dogs for explosives. Everything has to be very, very carefully checked, food brought on board, everything prepared, the staff gathered, etc.
Every person employed on the train underwent very strict controls.
Aryans only, very much like the SS, trace your lineage back to 1750, no Jews in the blood, anything like this. Perhaps reliable party people, vetting, very, very careful vetting.
Then there was Hitler's bodyguard, a special unit dedicated entirely to him. On board America, they had a car just for them.
This would be the RSD, the Reich Sicherheitsdienst. These are the closest bodyguards, and Hitler would carry anywhere from about 22 to 26 SS bodyguards on the train. These are the only men allowed anywhere near Hitler who are armed. Everybody else is unarmed, of course, for obvious reasons.
During America's journeys, there was always the same obsession with security, with an absolute control of everywhere the train would pass. Along the tracks, one soldier was posted on every 100 meters at vulnerable points, such as stations, bridges, and tunnels. The train itself was protected by heavy weaponry contained in the highly effective anti-aircraft cars, or Flakwagens. Positioned at the front and back of the train and totally autonomous, they provided protection from attacks by both air and land. 4 anti-aircraft guns on a turret at the front of the car. In the middle, the soldier's living space, with beds, a kitchen, a toilet and washroom, and a magazine for arms and munitions. At the rear, 4 more guns identical to the first set.
The 20mm guns were very effective because they could be used as anti-aircraft, being able to fire upwards to an altitude of about 2.5 kilometers. But they could also fire to the side at objects on the ground, at enemy troops or light vehicles that got too close to the train. Here their range was much greater because they could fire up to about 4.7 kilometers at ground targets, and they're thought to have had a rate of fire of about 800 rounds a minute. The full crew of the Flakwagen was between 25 and 30 men.
The advantage of the special train was that it gave Hitler the possibility of taking his entire war staff with him. But the Führer also needed to be able to travel anywhere and extremely quickly if need be. For this, his armored Mercedes followed the train, and an airplane was also permanently available along the route.
He also had his Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, his private 4-engine airliner. So as the train went from one stop to another, the plane preceded it and waited at an airfield that had been chosen in advance, ready to take Hitler and his staff wherever they needed to go, depending on the situation and the urgency.
In early 1940, with Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland now part of the new German Empire, the Führer began preparing his next offensives.
Hitler worked very hard on a well-designed attack against France. Well-designed because it was, what they didn't say back then, surgical. It was to nullify the French army and its weapons, then offer generous peace terms which France would not be able to refuse, because it had been disarmed in the early encounters, which had been well calculated by Hitler.
When France was attacked in the middle of May 1940, it didn't resist the speed and power of the German army for long. It laid down its arms 4 weeks later. All of Western Europe was now under the yoke of Nazism and fascism. Only Britain stood firm. On June 22, 1940, it was in a train that Hitler accepted the surrender of France. In a spirit of pure vengeance, the Führer demanded it be signed in the Rotonde clearing in Compiègne. In the same car, the armistice of 1918 had been signed.
Hitler's choice of place was far from neutral and far from innocent. It was a way of telling France that the chapter in which the Second Reich had capitulated lamentably in 1918 was now closed, and that the Third Reich had now made up for this insult.
Hitler returned victoriously to Berlin on July 6, 1940, on board America, the symbol of his might. A gigantic crowd gave him a hero's welcome. It would be the last time he mingled with the public.
He had enormous fears about his own security, and he may have had fears that public fervor was waning. And he needed this public fervor. It had given him a backbone of steel and immense confidence in the 1930s. So he decided not to take any risks with crowds that might not be as accommodating to him.
The general public slowly are pushed further and further away from the physical being of Hitler. And of course, this is good in many ways because it channels into the whole idea of Hitler being this kind of godlike figure, that he is not down amongst his people. He is a cult of personality figure removed from the ordinary German citizens.
America, like the other special trains, was pulled by 2 locomotives.
It wasn't because of the weight of the train. It was more of a guarantee that if one of the locomotives were to break down, the other one could continue the journey.
But a steam locomotive needed about 8 hours of preparation before it was ready to roll. Coal had to be fed into the hearth and fired to heat the 27,000 liters of water in the boiler and bring it up to pressure.
The autonomy of a steam locomotive was 250, 300 kilometers at the most. You couldn't get from Paris to Marseille with just one locomotive. After 150 kilometers, you had to start planning to stop and change, because the tender was empty. The locomotive would have consumed its 7 tons of coal and 30 tons of water in the first 150 to 200 kilometers. After that, you had to stop. They could hook up a new locomotive in about 2 minutes. It was very fast. They simply unhooked the empty one and gave you a full one. So for Paris to Marseille, you needed 10 to 15 locomotives. When the Orient Express went from Paris to Istanbul, it needed 30 or so locomotives. So the steam locomotive was a kind of traction relay, a bit like the old-fashioned postal service, where you change your team of horses every 30 kilometers or so.
America was no exception to this rule. On a 1,000-kilometer journey, like Berlin to Paris, for example, the 2 locomotives had to be changed at least 4 times. For the French track gauge, they were supplied by the SNCF, the French National Railway. All through the existence of Hitler's train, all types of electric and steam locomotives were used. The most notable was the famous BR-52, the war locomotive, which appeared in 1942.
The BR-52, nicknamed the Kriegslok, war loco, reinvented manufacturing methods because it was extremely simple. It was soldered together. There was no riveting, which is a very costly process. So there were no more rivets studding the boiler. It was a completely smooth cylinder. It was much lighter, as everything not considered totally useful was stripped away, so it was very light, but very muscular.
The BR-52 was the perfect wartime locomotive. It was assembled quickly, required few expensive raw materials, and little manual labor. In all, it made savings of 26 tons of materials and 6,000 man-hours of work.
It wasn't only built in Germany, but in all occupied countries. There are models made at Coqueril in Belgium, at Batignolles-Châtillon in Nantes, and at Schneider in Le Creusot and Paris.
For example, Skoda in Czechoslovakia. And companies in Alsace also built these war locomotives.
They were built in 17 different countries, in occupied countries or in those which used them after the war.
In the end, 6,285 war locomotives were built, which is a huge number. It was most probably the largest series of steam locomotives ever built.
In 1940, Hitler began planning a journey on America which would take him across France to a meeting with the Spanish dictator General Franco, whose country had officially ended its civil war, and Marshal Pétain, the leader of Vichy France. He was hoping to unite their forces against Great Britain, the only country as yet unconquered by fascism in Western Europe. It was a dangerous, top-secret route. Meticulous preparation was launched. Hitler left his residence, the Berghof, on October 20th to begin a three-leg voyage across France. As America gobbled up the kilometers, the Nazi security services traveled ahead of the train throughout the entire journey. Stations were informed only at the last minute, and the heads of the rail network only a few hours beforehand. Traffic was totally disrupted.
When Hitler's train was rolling on the network, all other trains ahead were parked on side tracks. No other trains were allowed to run. French railroad workers were even consigned to their work buildings, so they wouldn't be on the platform when the train passed. And all the tracks and bridges were checked to make sure there weren't any explosive devices that could derail the train.
In the stations, all documentation produced and used during the journey, even the most banal service notes, were destroyed at the end of each day. Nobody was allowed to know where America had been or where it was going. Plus, the security services had also put in place an extremely effective idea.
And so what they would do, some officials would run a train that looks quite similar to Hitler's train. Large express train with Pullman carriages. This would be run ahead of Hitler's train along the route that Hitler's train was going to take. So it would run about 20 or 30 minutes ahead. The idea being to trip any attack that was likely to happen. The people would attack that train rather than Hitler's train coming behind. And also sometimes there was another ghost train following behind Hitler's train, so you could be pretty confused which one to attack.
Hitler, en route for Hendaye on the border with Spain, made a first stop to meet with Pierre Laval, the then vice president of the Vichy Council, to prepare for the future meeting with Pétain. The meeting had to remain top secret and highly securitized. The ideal place had to be found between Paris and Hendaye, a place where nobody was expecting Hitler to turn up. It was to be the small town of Montoire-sur-le-Loire, where Hitler would arrive on October 22nd on board America. He was preceded by the special train of von Ribbentrop, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs. The town of 4,000 inhabitants had been carefully chosen by the Führer's staff.
The station was on a line some way off the main Paris-Hendaye line, and it was also close to a tunnel. The train would only have 3 kilometers to go to reach the safety of the tunnel. When you were on a passenger train during the war, even Hitler, it was like being on the open road and exposed to all kinds of danger.
The locomotives were kept at pressure so that the train could immediately depart for the tunnel, which shows how distrustful Hitler was and how concerned he was about his own security. He was convinced that the British, and later the Americans and Soviets, only dreamed of one thing: to kill him in order to end the war.
Since the beginning of the month, the small town had been under pressure. There were rumors, then more rumors, as 500 German soldiers began arriving in town. And silence gradually fell on that October 22nd of 1940.
The town was under very high security, with lines of sentries posted all around the station and German planes standing by for air surveillance. There were also soldiers placed at regular intervals between the station and the tunnel. One soldier every 20 meters for a 3-kilometer section of track equals 150 men, which is a huge number. All the access roads in and out of the town were blocked off. And there was a team constantly monitoring the post office's lines of communication, ready to cut them off if need be.
The town was literally under siege. People living close to the station were consigned to their homes, with shutters closed and the electricity cut off. Nobody could witness or know about Hitler's imminent arrival on America, which would stop at Platform 3 at 6:34 p.m. Pierre Laval arrived around 7 p.m. Hitler received him, accompanied by von Ribbentrop and the interpreter Paul Schmidt. The discussion was brief, about 45 minutes, just a few diplomatic preparations to ensure that Pétain agreed to meet with the Führer in 2 days' time. Hitler's special train, preceded by von Ribbentrop's, left Montoire during the night and reached Hendaye early in the afternoon of October 23rd for the meeting with the Spanish dictator.
The Secret Service were experts at creating red herrings. They'd report a train arriving one day. Oh no, it's 2 trains. Actually, it's not that day. They dissimulated as much as possible so that people knew as little as possible. There were also guards in all the stations, and possibly all along the forests of Les Landes. And then there was the problem of the track gauge. The Spanish gauge was 1.76 meters, as opposed to the French 1.44 meters, and so the 2 trains were blocked in Hendaye station. It was impossible to go any further.
Franco arrived slightly late. He boarded America and headed straight to Hitler's living room car for a meeting that would last 9 hours. But the meeting came to nothing. Franco had no intention of lining up Spain alongside Germany's forces, and Hitler did not insist, either clearly or firmly. The train set off from Montoire during the night of October 24th for the long-awaited meeting with Marshal Pétain. While the town center had regained a semblance of calm, the Germans made themselves busy. The station, a little away from the town center, was once again sealed off. The soldiers were on alert, air defenses at the ready. Once again, the world seemed to stop in this heavy atmosphere. Nothing filtered out about what was about to happen. Montoire had no idea that its future would be forever marked by the next few hours. Hitler's train arrived at 3:29 p.m. and stopped at Platform 3. Fog came in, and at 6 p.m., the French head of state, Marshal Pétain, arrived in his car with Pierre Laval.
Hitler waited patiently at the foot of his train, under the shelter between platforms 2 and 3.
The meeting between Hitler and Pétain was sealed with the famous, all too famous, handshake. Accompanied by von Ribbentrop, Paul Schmidt, and Pierre Laval, the Führer and Pétain settled down in the living room car. A 2-hour meeting laid the foundations for a French-German collaboration, validated a few days later by Pétain during his fateful speech of October 30th, 1940.
C'est dans l'honneur et pour maintenir l'unité française, une unité de 10 siècles, dans le cadre d'une activité constructive du nouvel ordre européen, que j'entre aujourd'hui dans la voie de la collaboration.
America left Montoire that same evening, heading back to Munich. Hitler learned that Mussolini was planning to invade Greece. He hurried to Florence to dissuade him, but arrived too late. Since 8 o'clock in the morning, Italian troops had landed on the Greek peninsula. Six months later, April 12, 1941. Monikirchen, a small town in the Austrian Alps near Vienna, welcomed for 2 weeks America and its Nazi ant nest. The train parked up at the entrance to a long tunnel of 2,700 meters in a valley just outside town next to a small hotel. The locomotives were kept under pressure, ready to get America to shelter in case of an attack. From there, Hitler directed the attack against Yugoslavia, which would give him access to Greece, where he could bring reinforcements to Mussolini, who had been unable to quash Greek resistance. Hitler spent the majority of his time shut away in his HQ on rails, directing operations. His link with the outside world was his communications car, with its state-of-the-art equipment which enabled him to stay in contact in real time with his forces on all fronts. This car was the 13th from the front, just after the one which housed Hitler's private bodyguard. You entered via the war room, the strategic car with hundreds of maps, which could be put up on the wall or consulted around a table. Next, the communication rooms, with all the high-tech of the 1940s. The first equipped with teleprinters and coding machines to cipher and decipher teletexts. Then the switchboards for calls coming in or going out and internal calls. And finally, the radio compartment with its Enigma machines for sending out coded messages and deciphering incoming ones.
Different parts of the armed forces are using different Enigma and enciphering machines. So to use these machines, they have to plug the Führer's personal carriage and the 2 or 3 communication carriages and the bodyguards' carriages into the postal telephone exchange. So fortunately, every station has all these plugs ready. They just take the leads and plug it all in. And within 20 to 30 minutes, everything is up and running. So he can start using telephones and talking to Russia or wherever. When he's on the move, he can't use the telephone, can't use the machines. They have to use instead a great big 700-watt shortwave radio. And this is also state-of-the-art stuff. And this stuff is being beamed out all over the place.
Hitler broke with the monotony of the campaign on April 20th, 1941, by celebrating his 52nd birthday in this bucolic countryside. During the 2 weeks spent at Monikilchen, he held numerous conferences and diplomatic meetings with the King of Bulgaria, the Regent of Hungary, the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the German ambassador to Hungary, some of whom also arrived by train. While Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were already subjugated, the Third Reich put a stranglehold on Yugoslavia, as it was the gateway to Greece. On April 26, 1941, America left Monikilchen, and the Führer reached the Chancellery in Berlin the following day, the day that Athens capitulated. From May 9, 1941, Hitler relaxed in the fresh air at the Berghof, his private residence in Bavaria, just before sending his country into a battle which would ultimately lead to its defeat, the invasion of Russia.
He's very, very proud of this house, which he paid for, the royalties of Mein Kampf, his book. And that is where he spends his time with Eva Braun, playing happy families, playing husband and wife, lots of children around, not his own children, the children of the leaders, Bormann and other people.
On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, and Germany invaded Russia. The Eastern Front would become the main theater of the German army's operations. From that moment on, change would set in. Hitler became more and more paranoid. He gradually cut himself off from the world as his hopes for a conquest of all Russia were thwarted. He only felt safe in bunkers. America would become merely a train to get him from A to B, but never again a mobile headquarters. The Führer felt it was too risky, despite its massive protection. 2 days after the invasion began, America arrived in Rostenburg in Poland. Hitler immediately ordered the construction of a 6-square-kilometer HQ surrounded by mined land. A collection of blockhouses, camouflaged bunkers protected by 2-meter-deep barbed wire, barrack for his soldiers, and log cabins dissimulated under layers of moss. 2,000 people lived in the so-called Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. The Führer spent just over 2 years in this dark forest, infested with mosquitoes, enduring stifling heat and humidity in summer, and deep snow and freezing temperatures in winter.
He names it the Wolf's Lair, the Wolfschanze, using a name he's used many times. He was known as Mr. Wolf earlier on in his life. And of course, the wolf is a symbol of strength and cunning. And of course, Adolf, his own name, is an old German name for wolf as well. So it's all of this kind of Germanic myth and everything else. But yeah, the Wolf's Lair is so important. It becomes his kind of sealed home, away from the reality of Berlin, away from the reality of much of what is happening in the rest of Europe. Until the very end. He only leaves when the Russians are almost at the gates. Only then is it evacuated and destroyed.
Throughout the war and his advances on various fronts, he would have constructed no fewer than 20 different HQs built around high-security bunkers. Excess and gigantism were also present 600 kilometers south of the Wolf's Lair, at Anlage Süd, Installation South. two monumental bunkers some 30 kilometers away for the purpose of housing special trains became operational in the summer of 1941. They were massive reinforced tunnels, built in just 10 months by hundreds of prisoners from concentration camps in Poland. Hitler and Mussolini met there for talks lasting several hours on the way to conduct war against the Soviet Union. Hitler's train was parked in the Strysov tunnel and Mussolini's in the Stepina tunnel. They were 480 meters long by 8.3 meters wide and 12 meters high.
The walls, over 2 meters thick of solid concrete, designed to do one thing, to shunt Hitler's train into a very, very secure location. The idea being that any attack was made on the train, they could seal both ends of the tunnels and literally fight it out until other German forces could arrive and rescue them. Now, the crazy thing is, all this time, effort, and money for 2 meetings only. These tunnels are only used twice in World War II for meetings with Mussolini. It is an absolute joke, but it shows again the paranoia, the level of paranoia surrounding Hitler.
Back at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler busily directed operations on the Eastern Front, where blood was being spilled battle after battle. This time, blitzkrieg tactics weren't working. The 4-month invasion plan turned into all-out war until defeat in May 1945.
The Red Army began to advance. The German army had reached its limits in terms of men and material. It was finding it harder and harder to reinforce its troops. That's why they brought in laborers from France and other occupied countries to replace as many German factory workers as possible, and to replenish the ranks of the army in Russia, which had suffered terrible losses at the hands of the Soviets.
As defeat followed defeat, Hitler became more and more authoritarian and shell-shocked. He was racked with doubts. From the summer of 1941 on, 80% of lives lost by the German army were in the Soviet Union.
As the military situation starts to turn against Germany, particularly by early 1942, the failure to take Moscow, and then of course the great disaster later of Stalingrad, Hitler becomes more and more isolated. He makes less public appearances and less speeches.
On December 7, 1941, the American naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, was hit by a surprise attack launched by the Japanese Imperial Fleet. The next day, America declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, which formed the Axis with Japan, riposted with the signing of the Tripartite Pact and declared war on the United States on December 12th. The conflict had become truly global.
I think Hitler declaring war on the United States after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor comes as a great surprise to many Germans, that he would voluntarily declare war on America in the midst of all of this trouble with the Soviet Union. It seems to me the megalomania is out of control by this stage. Insanity.
There was no way the special train could keep the name America. So it was renamed Brandenburg in a return to German roots.
Brandenburg,
like the heart of Prussia, like the region around Berlin. There had been also an SS division, Brandenburg, which was renowned for being particularly loyal to the Führer. I think that's probably where the name came from, because Brandenburg expressed a particular relationship to Hitler.
But as history is filled with twists and turns, it's the generic name Führersonderzug, Führer's special train, which has become most commonly used and fixed in the collective memory. Across the Channel, Britain was desperate to find a way to halt the Nazi machine, and the best way was by killing Hitler. In all, there were 30, some have suggested 40, failed assassination attempts against the Führer since he'd been in power.
He said he was protected by something that was beyond human control. He said the same thing after the failed attempt of July 20th, 1944. Once again, I have been protected by Providence. So he could never imagine his orders not being followed. He always believed there was something somewhere which would obey him.
In June 1944, the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, launched Operation Foxley, a top-secret plan which wasn't made public until 1998. The outline was simple: find a way to kill Hitler. Two main ideas were retained by the British agents. The first, to kill Hitler at the Berghof by parachuting in 2 elite snipers. The second, to blow up his train. But how would they get round the surveillance of this impregnable fortress? Several options were studied. Firstly, to derail the train. But this would require precise information regarding where the train was and when. Information seemingly impossible to obtain. Systematic searches of the rail infrastructure and the high-level security gave no chance of planting a bomb on the train. So a second possibility was looked into.
They studied the train's water supply very closely, and they realized that while food and bottled drinks were treated with maximum security, on-board drinking water was a weak link.
One German prisoner of war who had been a steward on the train revealed to the SOE that the tank with Hitler's drinking water was in his private dining car, just under the kitchen.
They studied ways of introducing poison into the water tank, and whether it would be undetectable. They thought that with the movement of the train, poison would mix with the water. They knew that Hitler drank lots of tea and he took it with a drop of milk. So they were hoping that the milk would be poured first and no one would notice that the color was a bit odd.
Hitler had a food taster, so anything that was given to him to eat or drink was tested first by somebody else. So that person would have dropped dead and it would have been quite obvious that there was something wrong with the water.
The poison was codenamed I. It was a slow-working poison.
Slow working indeed, because the famous I poison would kill 6 or 7 days after ingestion.
So even if Dr. Morel, who often tasted Hitler's food, were to taste his cup of tea, he wouldn't die immediately. Neither would Hitler, and nobody would go running around madly looking for an antidote. So there was a good chance it just might work.
But in 1944, with Nazi Germany on the back foot, there was a fierce debate within SOE ranks. Should we kill Hitler? While everyone wanted him dead, many feared that his assassination by the enemy would turn him into an idolized martyr.
I think the decision was taken not to kill him because Hitler, by late 1944, had become our greatest asset in the West. He was mismanaging the war to such a degree, making so many stupid decisions. He was shortening the war effectively. So keeping Hitler alive was actually the best thing to do, shockingly.
From December 11th until January 15th, 1945, Hitler directed the Battle of the Ardennes from his headquarters at Adelhorst, north of Frankfurt. His objectives were grandiose, but as if to give reason to the British SOE, Hitler confirmed his strategic weaknesses, seemed to cut himself off from the world, and moreover, lacked the means to see his ambitions through. The defeat of Germany would be all the more a bitter failure.
News arrives midway through the Battle of the Bulge that the Soviets have launched this enormous offensive, gigantic offensive which has destroyed the German army largely in the east, and they are pouring through Poland into East Prussia.
Hitler was forced to withdraw to Berlin. He didn't know it yet, but it was to be his last ever journey on board the Führersonderzug, his train which had never been attacked, his train which had taken him rapidly towards a new European order in the early days of war. From the window of his train car, Hitler became aware of the extent of the devastation. Berlin had been bombed to smithereens. It was then that he realized the great new German Empire would never be, that the war was over, that he had lost. It was January 16th, 1945.
But despite his capital lying in ruins, he still had a small belief that he should set out to attack.
He left the Führersonderzug at the small station of Grunwald to the west of Berlin, which had already seen the special train pass on numerous occasions. But other special trains too, those taking millions, most of them Jews, to the hell of the concentration and extermination camps.
He set up office in the Chancellery, not right away in his bunker. But the Chancellery in Berlin had been bombed so much it was pretty much unusable. All the windows had been blown out, and this was at the height of winter.
Mid-April 1945, Hitler locked himself away definitively in his bunker beneath the Chancellery. He watched on powerless as the Soviet army took Berlin. On April 20th, he celebrated his last birthday. On the 29th, he married his companion, Eva Braun. During the night, he dictated his political testament. And the next day, at 3:15 p.m., he and his new bride committed suicide in their bedroom. Their bodies would be doused with gasoline and burned. The following week, on the edge of a ravine in Malnitz, the fate of the Führer's private saloon car lay in the hands of the SS. It was May 7th, 1945. The time, 3 p.m.
The SS decided to blow up Hitler's private car, so they filled the inside with gasoline, planted dynamite and grenades, set it alight, and the whole thing blew up.
The Nazis didn't want this highly symbolic car to fall into the hands of Allies to be displayed as a trophy of war in Paris, London, New York, or Moscow. Not a single piece of Hitler's private car should survive. It all had to burn into thin air. World War II ended on September 2nd, 1945. In defeat, Germany was divided amongst the Allies. But it still wasn't the end for the Führersonderzug.
So the Americans get wind of it, they come and take over. Thank you very much, that's now US Army property, Hitler's train. And the British say, well, we quite fancy some of that as well. So it's divided up. So some carriages go to the British, some carriages go to the Americans, and they use it. Various generals who are in charge in the Allied occupation zones use it as their private train, which is spoils of war, of course.
In the early 1950s, the various cars from Nazi special trains were returned to the West German state. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer composed his official train with some of the remaining Führersonderzug cars. And it was on board this train that he made his official trip to Moscow in 1955, a kind of thumbing his nose at history 10 years after the fall of Berlin. Then the special train cars were updated, refurbished, modernized, and dispersed. In the 1960s, Queen Elizabeth II and the Beatles couldn't have imagined that when traveling in Germany, they were in the private car of Hitler's Minister of Transport, who had organized all special train journeys during the war years. In the 1970s, it was Chancellor Willy Brandt who made use of the remaining car from Hitler's train. After 1980, none of the special train cars were ever used again. The steel beast was made in the image of its master. It personified one of the worst murderers in modern history, accompanied him on all fronts and in all his crazy decisions, and it provided a haven for him when the world was slipping out of his grasp forever. Of the Führersonderzug, despite the weight of its history, barely anything remains. Just a few rail cars sitting at the back of a museum.